Let us pray together. Lord, open our ears as we listen for your word. We long to know you, to understand life, and to be changed. Examine us, transform us. Amen. Sometimes you are just tired. And when you get tired, what is the first part of your body that just kind of shuts down? Your eyes, right? It's like it's just trying to shut all the distractions out in the world. You just can't keep your eyes open. I can't remember how many Sunday afternoons we'd go home and my dad would sit down in his chair and there'd be football or bowling or golf or baseball on the TV. And I would think that he was asleep because his eyes were closed. But he wasn't asleep. He was watching that. So you couldn't change the channel. But you could just tell, you know when you're getting tired, and that first thing to go is your eyes. You just can't keep them open. It was hot. I was tired. I had just crawled into bed, and all I wanted to do was fall asleep before I realized how hot it was. That day was spent on the roof with Todd and with Greg, moving and installing solar panels in Haiti. And I was physically and emotionally spent. And as I began to pray, I realized that exhaustion of everything else in the world and in my life, and that physical exhaustion was slipping into my spirituality, as I couldn't focus enough to pray. You ever been there? Have you ever just been that tired? It's in times like that I'm actually very relieved to know that God still knows, that God still cares, that God is still listening. Because before Jesus gives his followers a framework for prayer and an orientation for life, he tells us something of great comfort. He says, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. God knows what you need before you ask. God knows the words to our prayers before they form on our lips. It is only after he says this that he continues, pray then in this way. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. And in this simple prayer, Jesus changes so much for us. Don't we like simple prayers sometimes? When we were doing the Christmas celebration, before we had the celebration, I asked if there was anybody who wanted to pray for the meal. And the first and only person to raise their hand was Jada, our daughter. And we were like, okay, sure, you can do it. And she came up and she gave like a 5-word prayer. I got so many compliments on that prayer. Sometimes we really like the simple prayer because it gets to the heart of what's happening. And Jesus shows us a simplicity of faith. And he adds to this prayer through verse 21. So we'll skip ahead a little bit in our reading to verse 21, where he says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Pastor theologian Gerald C. Lew writes that Jesus instructs his disciples not to overvalue the inflated language of the Gentiles, but to pray with simplicity because God already knows what they need before they ask. His prefatory remarks have an economic dimension to them by implying that worthwhile prayers unfold efficiently and come straight from the heart. I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me that they don't know how to pray. And here Jesus is giving us this framework that prayer, the prayer that God asks from us, is nothing more than what is on our hearts. And though Matthew 6:21 follows verses that directly speak about the impermanence of physical possessions, Its connection to the preciousness of prayer seems quite clear. Faithful prayers do not waste words. They also mine the riches of what is known by God in the heart. It is what is within that God is asking for us to communicate. Dennis Dooling notes that the advice from Jesus is also not incidental because at this time, Jewish customs expected adult males to pray morning and evening 3 times in the direction of Jerusalem, before and after meals, and in a number of postures, things like bowing and standing. That's an awful lot of prayer. There was a lot of room to reach. If you're praying that often and you're required to pray that often, there's a lot of room to reach for all this fluffy phrasing or to start worrying about making a mistake in the prayers you're doing. And so Jesus clears the air not only with advice, but also with this paradigm of prayer. He doesn't say, pray this prayer. He says, pray then in this way. Another scholar, Ulrich Luz, points out that in Matthew's prayer, Jesus uses the language of the people, Aramaic, rather than the language of the synagogue, Hebrew. The vocalization of the prayer, therefore, re-articulates the importance of being direct. Lutz also states that the prayer does not encapsulate Christian belief, doctrine, or dogma. It is not a theological statement, but a model to help others to pray. It makes prayer possible. It's a model for how we should be viewing the world and living. Because by locating God above all, acknowledging the name of God as holy, privileging God's kingdom and God's will, and petitioning for the gifts of daily bread, the gifts of forgiveness, the gifts of mercy to those in our debt, and deliverance from trial and the wicked, this prayer of Matthew 6 provides this remarkably streamlined but robust and clear outline for what our prayers ought to include. And it is this amazing scaffolding to unlock this architecture that is present in these later verses. He doesn't just drop this prayer and walk away. Jesus continues with, after then pray in this way. He gives us a prayer and then says, for if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. And whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so as to show others that they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may be seen not by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. This whole text is used every year for Ash Wednesday, so it should seem fairly familiar to us. In about a month's time, we'll most likely revisit this text again. And every time I hear it, over the last several years, there's one story that always comes to mind, and it's from our disciples theologian in the state of Ohio, Jeff Gill, a pastor, who likes to share this story about why pews a lot of times are so empty in the front rows of churches. I'm glad to see that's not the case right now. But it's because a long time ago, you used to pay your tithe, you paid to be able to sit in church. And so the richest people paid more so that they could sit up front, not because they needed more churching, but so they could be seen by everyone else. So that the people in the back could be like, oh, they must have wealth. They must be doing well. So that they could be praised by others. And as Church went on. I guess all those rich people stopped coming, and it was only the poorer people in the back that still came. And so all the front rows started to empty out. That's the conclusion that he comes to. Do not do these things for others, but do them for God. These pious actions that are discussed in these verses following that prayer rely upon the purposes of prayer that are laid out in the Lord's Prayer. The warning to forgive with abandon, instructions to fast with nonchalance, and caution to resist stockpiling stuff read as embodied interpretations of Matthew's prayer. This is how this prayer works in our daily lives. Because prayer goes beyond words, it involves action and devotion. When bad things happen, thoughts and words are not enough. When disaster strikes, or when good needs celebrating, actions and devotions, prayers are necessary. As Jesus reorients our understanding of prayer and faith, we must ask how our lives need to be reoriented too. As we look around, what should we be seeing? Or are we just too exhausted that we can't open our eyes enough? There's some really amazing stuff about light that I've learned recently. This part I didn't learn recently, but our scriptures begin with God saying, "Let there be light." Yes, okay, good. Some people have read the beginning, right? Let there be light. Did you know that the light that we see comes from a star that is 8 light minutes away? We all knew that part, right? It takes 8 minutes for a photon to leave the sun to get to Earth. And that all that we see when we are outside using sunlight, not artificial light, that all that we see is light that is 8 minutes old. But more than that, this is the most amazing part to me. The photons that are that light come from deep within the star that is our sun. And you wouldn't think, if it takes 8 minutes to get from the sun to here, you wouldn't think it would take that long to get from the center of the sun, the outer edges of the sun. But there's this problem in that there's so much packed into the sun that for every step that a photon makes, it can move backwards. The layman's term for this problem, I forget the exact terminology, but it's something called like the drunken walking problem. And the idea is that if you put a drunkard between 2 light posts, they might only be 17 steps away, but the way that they walk might take them a lot more than 17 steps to get there. That's a photon traveling out of our sun. The end result of that photon's trip, it began over 5,000 years ago in the center of our sun. 5,000 years to get from the center to the outer edge and another 8 minutes to get here. So everything that we see from the sun is a much longer and deeper story than we first think. I wonder if we appreciate the depth of what we see. Have you ever bought a new car or a new phone or something else new and you think it's so special, but then after you get it, you realize that there's a whole bunch of other ones right around you? Like everyone has it? Have you ever had that? It happens with cars a lot, that's what I've been told. It's known as the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. How stuff works explains it like this. They say that this phenomenon occurs when the thing you've just noticed, experienced, or been told about suddenly crops up constantly. It gives you the feeling that out of nowhere, pretty much everyone and their cousin are talking about that subject, or that it's swiftly surrounding you. You know, like when you have a conversation with somebody, and then you look on Facebook and it's giving you an ad for the thing you just talked about? Right? That one you know. And you're not crazy, you're totally seeing it more. But the thing is, of course, that's because you are noticing it more. A couple of things happen with this phenomenon when it kicks in. One is your brain seems to be excited by the fact that you've learned something new or that you've got something new, and that selective attention occurs. And your brain subconsciously thinks, hey, that's really awesome. I'm going to look for that thing without actually thinking about it. So now you're looking for it, you find it, and to make it all the more powerful, confirmation bias occurs after seeing it even once or twice. So in other words, you start agreeing with yourself that yes, you are definitely seeing it more. When we place our hearts into those things with deep meaning in our lives, those things that are a part of God's call, those mission opportunities, those interactions, those relationships that have the depth of the Spirit. Not those surface level things, not those things that we do just to be seen, not those fluffy things or those long-winded prayers or whatever else we might do just so others can give us some notice and attention, but those things with actual depth. When we live out this prayer, when we place our efforts there, we'll find our treasure and we'll see more and more of the same. We'll see more opportunities to serve. We'll see more deep and rich and meaningful relationships manifest themselves, more times and chances to love and to be Christ followers. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we see? When we look at this table, what do you see? Communion. Do we see an isolated incident that happens only today and only in this place and only in about, 45 minutes to an hour from now when I'm done? No. No, what we see is a connected practice, deep in ritual and meaning that brings people together around the globe, regardless of what is happening in our lives, regardless of how we feel or who we are. Through all of time, God brings people together around this table where we center ourselves on the forgiveness that we find here. When we see this building, what do we see? What do you see? Church. Do we just see bricks and mortar? Love. That was an awesome answer. We see a ministry center, a place of welcoming for all, a lively place where people are filled with love so that they might be the light in the world and in the lives of others. When we see that little red book that's in the pews pockets in front of you, maybe you've picked one up before, I don't know. What do you see? Do you see just words on a page? Or do you see God's guidance and help, a source of life to refuel us in our walks? When we see ministry team openings, or we hear about worship committee meeting on the fourth Wednesday, or participation in missions meeting this week, when we hear about board openings and committee meetings, what do we see? Do we see just another thing to put on our calendar? More stress in our lives? Or do we see an opportunity to answer a call and to serve? When we see negative degrees on the thermometer, I already heard from somebody this morning that said they just didn't leave their house all week, which is pretty awesome actually, right? When we see negative degrees on the thermometer, what do we see? Do we see an opportunity to serve? Our city needs places of warmth, and maybe we're called to be that. Now, some responded to the potential to serve, and through the Salvation Army, they said we weren't needed this time, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't be in the future. But if we feel that this is a true calling, then we need names and a protocol for being an overnight warming center. When we see a negative general fund number, what do we see? Do we see despair and angst and anger? Or do we see a chance for a new understanding and resources? We've applied to a program called Generosity Plus, but we need lay leaders to be a part of that program. And when we see the poor, what do we see? People who put themselves in that place? People who just need to try harder? No. We see Christ. We see God in the marginalized, God on the edges of society, those people that we have cast out, and we see an opportunity to serve. And so we answer, and we do. And we do in many ways, and one way that we do that is through Impact Massillon. But to be able to do Impact Massillon, we need leaders, lay leaders, to answer that call. Now we could go on and on. In our lives, we are told what to see, but Jesus prefaces his prayer with the insistence that God knows our inmost thoughts. God knows our needs. God knows our hearts before we ask, before we even know. God knows what we truly see in the response we should have. So we don't need to lie to ourselves. We don't need to fancy up our languages or our lives with empty rhetoric and dress. God calls us to devotion and action where we respond to what we see in our world. And there are so many here who have responded. And so I think it's fitting for us to start by thanking some of them. Thanking those of you who serve and respond to the call they receive. And so I ask that Sue Keir, Lucy Mead, Linda Remark, and Phyllis Hale come forward.